You guys hear me? Okay. Hello, everybody. My name's Ken Herring. I know many of you have probably seen a lot about VS Code today, but I'm here to talk even more about it. This is me. Somebody said I don't look like that picture. I think I do. But these slides will be on the internet. You can find the links there. My GitHub's on there. We're going to have some code shown here that is also all available up there, probably with some improvements out of this. So you can find me there. A little bit about me before we get started. I'm from Tampa, Florida, so it was quite a long trip to get here. I'm finally getting over my jet lag just in time to go home. Before Florida, I lived in Pennsylvania, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, which was awesome but cold, hence the move to Florida. I've been writing code my whole life. I was born a nerd, pretty much, but they've been paying me for that skill since 2010, which I also first started using OpenEdge at the same time. So I have about 13 and a half years of experience with OpenEdge. I started my career as a lot of people that have programmed OpenEdge in ERP software at a small company called Apprise Software. That was in Bethlehem, PA. But now for the last, I want to say 6 years, I'm now a staff engineer at Rocket Mortgage, which is in the financial industry. We do mortgages all over the United States and Canada. I have 2 dogs, Maya and Lily. If you were at my thing yesterday, I promised I'd have new pictures of them today. The top one is a black lab who thinks she can turn into a yellow lab by getting all of the sand in my car. A quick agenda, and this is a little bit flexible because I know there's a lot of VS Code stuff going on today, so I'll get a kind of a feel for the room in a second here. We can adjust. We'll talk a little bit about what is VS Code, why should you use it. If you're here and you're not using it, it means you may want to be convinced, and then we can make sure that happens. We'll talk a little bit of info about Docker. My goal here was to kind of explain how we use Docker in conjunction with VS Code to have consistent development environments. And I'm not going to go too deep on a ton of details about Docker, but give you some tools that you may be able to take back and expand on as you venture down a development path with VS Code. And some of that can be used with PDSOE or any other environment as well. And then one thing that we've been using more recently, and I don't even think this was in my original description because we didn't have access to it then, but is GitHub Copilot. AI is the fad right now, and I don't think it's going to be a fad for long. I think it's just going to stick around. And I have Copilot installed here in VS Code. We'll try it out. We'll see if we can get it to do some cool stuff. It does imagine good progress code fairly frequently. It also imagines Python instead of progress sometimes, but we will see what we can get out of it. So I have a couple slides to go through. We'll talk for a little bit, and then we'll jump into a live demo. I have a couple things I want to show, but we can treat it as a Q&A as well. So if you guys have questions, if you want to dig in more to something that I'm showing, we can do that. If we want to talk about something completely different, I'm good with that too. We can just kind of see what you guys need. So, but before we go any further, who here uses VS Code now for OpenEdge development? So half the room. Who here was in at least one VS Code session earlier today? Okay. So we have a pretty good mix, which kind of goes into my next slide a little bit. Just set some expectations for this session. Target audience, anyone who writes code. If you've never written a line of code in your life, I'm not really sure why you're interested in VS Code, but I think we might be able to find something you can take away here. I'd imagine most of the room is developers, though. So for existing users, I mean those that had their hand up saying you use VS Code, I hope you'll be able to walk away with some new skills that you can use, or some new ideas that you can steal, build upon for your development environments. And for people that aren't using VS Code, I hope with what you see here, you'll take this away and you'll decide, hey, I need to try that out. There's clearly benefits to it that I'm not yet seeing in my development workflow. So that's what we're hoping to get here. So real quick, I think if you're here, you probably know somewhat about what VS Code is. But just the high level is, what is VS Code? I just stole that first line right from their website. You go to vscode.com. It says code editing redefined. And I made up the next gen ID. I don't know if they like that terminology, but I do. I totally agree with what they're saying. I started using VS Code a little more than a year ago. And I actually found it made me much more excited to write code than I had been in a long time, just because of the ease of use, the problem solving that I had for a lot of different things that we can talk through here. It's language agnostic. I think this is a huge selling point. Many of us, myself included, work in shops where there's a clear divide between our open edge engineers and our non-open edge engineers. And that is problematic for a variety of reasons. Probably the biggest one being is that the open edge engineer, from either side, it's difficult for an engineer that programs in C# to come do anything in progress. It's difficult for somebody that only does progress to go do something in C#. And I find that VS Code is going to be a primary component of bridging that gap to make our engineers have another tool in their kit and be able to kind of cross that language barrier a little easier. And I think that's a huge selling point for a lot of us. It's extensible via plugins. If you've heard about VS Code and you've been in any of the sessions, I'm sure you've heard that. We're going to look at a few here. I'm not going to harp on that too much, just because that's the thing that people generally go to first. And I want to try and stick to a little bit different topic of how to use it for our workflows. But certainly, because of how extensive the plugins are to the application, we're not going to be able to not talk about it. It's highly configurable. If you don't like the way something works, there's probably an option for it. Part of that too, one of the things I mentioned is we're going to talk about development environment consistency, and I want to talk through a little bit about how we've taken the settings that we use and through the ability to share settings both within and outside of a repo allows us to have more consistent development environments. Specifically, nobody likes the works on my machine problem. That's no fun. And we've done a really good job at avoiding that through a lot of the VS Code configuration in conjunction with Docker. So why use VS Code? I threw a little Jetsons thing out there because it's the future. Modernization is the talk of the town. If you look at the topics for the sessions here this week, modernization is a title on like half of them or something, at least a third. I don't really like that term. There's a couple terms that I don't like that get used a lot. Another one I don't like, not related to any of this, is finalize. If you ever get a task that says you're finalizing something on your project, I always push back because how's it ever final? We're writing code. We're iterating forever. Modernization is another one I don't like for the same reason, because what's modern today is legacy tomorrow. But if we're modernizing in the theme of it, VS Code certainly fits that theme. Hopefully, it's more that we're just continually moving forward, and VS Code is a way for us to build upon that iterativeness. Like I mentioned, it's language agnostic. Why use it? Skills are translating to other languages. I'll show an example here later. I have one environment set up for writing OpenEdge, and then I'll open up another folder that looks nearly identical, but all it is Java. And everything works the same. You don't have to relearn. You have to know differences in the language, but you don't have to relearn an IDE. You don't have to go learn Eclipse again. It's got regular updates with new features. I am such a nerd. I read the release notes. I read the release notes every time Progress puts them out. I read them every time VS Code puts them out. And all of the details about them. There's all sorts of new stuff in it, always. It's also open source, so you can go make, if you don't like the way something works and it doesn't have a setting, go add a setting for it. And then GitHub Copilot. We'll talk more about that in a minute. A couple of limitations. So it's not, certainly not a Pandora. There are problems that we run into, specifically For OpenEdge, if you are using, I had a talk yesterday about SonarQube rules, custom rules for OpenEdge. Custom rules don't currently work here. You're only going to get the commercial rules from the Cabal plugin. That is a temporary problem. We're gonna get access to the custom rules shortly. Just waiting on Gilles for that. But it is a problem nonetheless if you do have custom sonar rules. And then some PDSOE features may be missing. I really don't use PDSOE at all anymore. But I know that there's features that people love, maybe like linking to the app builder or the class docs. While we do have class docs in VSCode, they're a little different. I'm sure if you're using some of the more obscure OpenEdge functionality, you can certainly, will be missing it. And there may be ways to add it back. But just as long as we're talking about limitations, be aware that may be the case. So some VS Code features, and this list is going to go through some of the things I want to walk through, but we can certainly adjust if needed. I said I wasn't going to talk a lot about plugins, but it's my first bullet point, and you can't get away from it. OpenEdge ABL, I know there was a session on that earlier, so we're not going to spend a ton of time on that. Circle CI, Sonar Lint, and so on. I have another session tomorrow about build pipelines, where I'm going to talk about how to use build pipelines for quality control. So basically making sure you're not putting in code that you don't want into your production environments or deploying it to customers. And we'll talk more about that there. I'm going to touch on it a little bit here to show how those plugins play into a little bit of my development flow. We're going to talk about Copilot. Other features, source control integration. Git is specifically built in. You download it, it has Git right in it. But I know even just talking to some people here this week, not everybody is using Git necessarily, but there are plugins for other source control providers, probably most of them, unless you've written something in-house. In that case, you might have to do it yourself. But VS Code was designed around having source control as a primary component and not specifically Git. It just so happens that that's the popular one. That's the one that they include by default. If you haven't seen it before, we're going to talk about code snippets a little bit. Not just at a high level. I want to get into some of the detail on how they can be used. We've found some really cool functionality that allows them to be configurable in a way where you get a lot more out of them than just saying, okay, we're defining a character variable. You can make them a little bit more configurable than that. So we'll take a look at that. Refactoring made easy. A lot of times when you want to change the name of a variable, it's as simple as right-clicking on it and you can change it everywhere. And there's a couple other things we'll take a look at there as well. And I think this one might be my favorite, is tasks. Built in, there's the ability to run tasks. You can run. I have one task we're going to say that runs on startup to create, development databases or schema databases. You can use tasks to start Docker containers. You can use tasks to run unit tests. You can use basically anything you can do in a shell script or with a process. Anything you do from the command line, you can set up as a task. I find them highly powerful. We've been using a ton of them, and I'll give some examples here. I have a couple in mind that we might just try to write one from scratch if we have time. And the debugger, if anybody's used the debugger for OpenEdge, I have a love-hate relationship with debuggers. I really love them when I need them to solve a problem and they get me the answer right away. And I hate them because I always forget about them until I have like 45 message statements in my code. And then I don't remember which ones were which, and I'm like, well, I should just use the debugger. So far, VS Code has not changed my mind enough that I should just go to that first, but I hope it will. But it certainly works with OpenEdge, and we'll give it a try. And more. There's plenty more. Go to the help docs. You can find all sorts of different features. It's endless. I could not list them all here if I tried. So Docker and VS Code. So take a quick poll. How many people here use Docker with OpenEdge in any way? Couple, 5, 6, 7. Okay. So Progress has Docker containers. They have Docker containers with all the versions in it. And they can be used for a variety of things. We don't use them for any of our production deployments at all, but we do use them extensively for our development environments. Primarily, we use them to keep all of our developers in sync for two reasons. One, so that everybody has the same schema as what's on our shared environments, so our dev, test, beta, and prod. And two, because we have the cardinal sin of when somebody decided to start unit testing, they decided to start with a database that had a set of data in it. And the Docker containers help us make sure that set of data stays the same across everybody. So if you're not unit testing and not using Docker, and you decide to do that, start with empty databases, please. Docker containers, Docker containerizes applications to improve portability and remove dependency issues. I'll wait till my last bullet point to touch on that a little bit more. I don't know what I meant by that. Many applications to development. Oh, Docker has many applications to development, and it makes a lot of things kind of along the lines of what I was mentioning of keeping databases in sync, keeping data in sync, keeping environments in sync across different machines is a lot easier with Docker. It certainly applies to VSCode, and we'll see some examples of that. So the consistent environments and databases. And then another thing I'm going to talk about is dev containers. Dev containers are basically a containerized development environment where you can, even without having Progress installed, if you pull a container that is set up as a dev container, you can connect to it with VS Code and have a full-fledged development environment that is exactly the same as anybody else using that dev container. If you've seen Git pods or any of the remote VS Code development, that's how that works. That's all running, generally speaking, with dev containers. And we'll have an example of how you can set that up locally to start trying it out and see if that's something that may work for you. So a dev container, what the heck is it? I kind of touched on it a little bit, but it's a concept where the development environment's fully within a Docker container. If you were in any of the other sessions, I know the one I had before this had a diagram very, very similar to this. But essentially what we're seeing here is like this part on the right is the container. Excuse me. And it has basically all of the things you need to run your application. So for us, that has Progress. It has a thing called One Agent that sends data to Dynatrace. It has all the other plugins that we need to run our application. And then on your local machine, all you need is VS Code. And this has a thing at the bottom that says source code. So in this example, they're saying the source code is mounted into that container. That's actually not even necessary. If you have the source code within that container, you don't even need the source code on your local machine. You just need it. You just need that container, and VS Code can connect to it and do what it needs to do. GitHub code spaces. I think somebody's calling it GitHub pods. Code spaces is another thing. I don't know if they're changing the branding or if it's two different things, but they both use that same concept. And the benefits, like I said, team consistency. That's the number one selling point for us, is just the consistency across what our engineers are using. I can't remember the last time I had a works on my machine problem with our application that leverages this. I have it with other things, but certainly not with our unit tests in our primary application. I don't think we're using this a ton, but if you're using a dev container, you can get away without having Progress installed locally on your machine. You do not need it. It's in the container, and that will be enough to work sufficiently. Quick ramp up, too. I don't know how long the onboarding time is for your companies. At my company now, having containers has significantly decreased ramp-up time. In the past, I've worked places where they were really good at, you show up, you have a machine, it has Progress on the database, and everything works. And then on other teams, I've been there where it takes 3 weeks before anybody can get the right permissions to get Progress installed on that machine. This cuts down, in that second use case, this cuts down on a lot of that. So that may be a selling point for you, or if you're already quick, then it may not be. Lastly, and then we'll kind of get into the demo here, is GitHub Copilot. I looked today for the logo for this little guy because I really like him, and they stopped using it, and I'm very annoyed by that. I don't know why. They just have, it's just text now, GitHub Copilot. And I thought he was really cool. So, but it is a VS Code plugin, surprise. A lot of plugins. It's AI that helps write code. Just reading through their, selling sheet earlier, doesn't write perfect code. It's a robot. It's not putting us out of a job. If it wrote perfect code, none of us would need to be here anymore. But it does help kind of guess what you're trying to do. And surprisingly, it guesses at OpenEdge fairly well from time to time. A couple stipulations on that. We'll talk through it when we try it out here. It does a decent job with OE code. Similar to IntelliSense, but better. We had a guy at my company, we were piloting Copilot, that said he didn't understand why it was so good because IntelliSense did what he needed. Turns out he didn't have the plugin enabled, and now that he does, he's in love with it. So I think IntelliSense is going to be a thing of the past with Copilot coming to light. And this is where I find it maybe most valuable. There's one other thing that maybe I find it more valuable with, but just reducing repetitive tasks. If you're writing code where you're defining a bunch of variables that are matching the input variables for your method, it's going to be enter, tab, enter, tab, enter, tab. It's just going to know what you're doing. It's super, super efficient for things like that. And then we're going to get into a live demo. Does anybody have questions before we start with that? Within my company? So the question was, you wouldn't need progress. So when using a dev container. And we've had a couple people do that. I think they've already had progress installed, but I've taken the approach with people that don't use it often. Use this dev container, because we don't want to mess around with however you screwed up your local environment. So we don't have a ton. I think if we were going to transition to using GitHub pods or something, we absolutely would. It still requires a license. So you still need a progress license. So it doesn't take away from that. Yeah. Yeah, we have absolutely done it. Yeah. Any other question? Yeah.
What about the Windows stuff? Can you develop the Windows?
So the question is, what about the Windows stuff? You might hit a limitation there. This is more for developing any code that's going to run on PDSOE, anything that's going to run under Unix. I think anything that's going to absolutely be Windows dependent, you wouldn't be able to get away from. But that might change with time. The Windows containers are a thing. We don't mess around with Windows containers very much. Progress does not provide a Windows container out of the box, but I would imagine that if you created a Windows container with a Progress install, you could potentially get away from that. I'd be surprised if it was impossible. Anybody else? All right. Let's see. So I'm just going to start. I just want to open a new window here. So I know we had a lot of people that are very familiar with VS Code. I'm going to try not to do a whole lot of just super basics, but I do want to start off there. For those that use VS Code and those that are just getting started with it, I know it's really, really easy to skip over the main window. And this is something I go over with my coworkers a lot. But there's actually a lot of valuable information right here. And it changes. So when there's a new release, you're going to see these things change. When you do different activities or you use different plugins frequently, you're going to see the information here change. I highly suggest you take time every once in a while, take a look at it, walk through some of these things. Yeah, you're going to say, okay, this is useless. I already know this. I don't need that. And then other times you're going to look at it and be like, oh, wow, this is way easier. This is a way easier method to approach something than maybe you were doing. I haven't looked through this Java one since it said new. I know I've looked through it before. I know they have a new version out. There may be something in there that I find valuable. So if that's something you haven't been doing, highly suggest it. And then there's also another thing I show users, and this may not be super helpful for you, but as you help your other engineers with VS Code, I find this helpful. Control-Shift-P is the command palette. It brings you right to where everything in the whole application is at. And I find people forget that a lot, and yet it's always right here in the middle. Pointing people towards those 4 things right in the middle, I find helps a lot. So if you haven't noticed that before or haven't been helping your other users at your company, remember that that's there. Use that as a takeaway. I found that to be highly effective at getting other new users involved and cutting down the fear of switching to a new IDE, because I think for a lot of engineers it's difficult to want to switch. You don't want to have to learn something new, and especially with the configurability of VS Code, that can be scary. So what I have here, open the wrong one, we'll close that. What we have here, and I will make this font bigger. I apologize if it wasn't bigger before. Is that okay for everybody? I'm saying got a positive head nods. So this is a repo that I've put together. I've been working with this for the last, week or so, just for this conference. Both for a little bit for yesterday's session, mostly for today and tomorrow's session. It's nothing too fancy. I don't even have a ton of progress code in here. But this does is it kind of mimics a lot of what we use internally at Rocket Mortgage for basically to keep our development environments consistent and to, one, consistency, and 2, to make sure that all of the stuff that our build pipeline does is also here and easily accessible to all of our engineers. And I wanted to mimic that and show some new things, some new tools that you may be able to take away and use as well. This is available on GitHub. My GitHub was on the first link there. You can come ask me for it. You can find me. It's just Ken Herring is the username. But all of this code's up there. I'm probably going to build on this. Not probably. I tend to build on this a little bit over time. Just to have some good examples out there of things that I haven't seen publicly available that I think should be, that show how easy it is to tie OpenEdge into a lot of very commonly used tools. So just high-level overview, for example, we use Circle CI as our build runner, and I'm not, like I said, I don't want to get too much into build pipelines, but you can see we have our Circle CI directories. We are going to talk about this one, dev container, which is just where I'm storing the configuration to run dev containers. I have some Docker stuff. I don't think Docker directories are super common. There's a little bit of junk in here too, just from messing around over the last couple of days. But we'll see a little bit about developing Docker containers. I still have some PDSOE settings in here. I haven't decided if I want to wipe those out of here yet. I think I do. But theoretically, you could have a repo set up where you can open it in both PDSOE and VSCode and develop, theoretically both at the same time if you wished. I don't know why you would want to use both at the same time, because if you're familiar enough with VSCode, it seems crazy to want to go back to PDSOE to me. But at the same time, I would never stop anybody from using the development environment of their dreams. Some tools, those are just, we'll talk a little bit about that. Those aren't specific to anything. VSCode, we will talk about a lot of what's in here, specifically tasks. Some of the settings and the configuration. Try not to go too simple on that, especially for those that were in some of the earlier meetings. And then the schema, SRC, you could guess those are just DF files, and this is source code. And like I said, I don't have a ton in here. We'll write some, but it's mostly just there to show, hey, we can run this. This is how it can be used with Docker. And then a handful of other config files. And a log file that needs to not be in that spot. I know I need to move that. So let's see, where do we want to start? Let's start with just running code. I'll show an example of some of the stuff that we have here. For example, and none of this is very fancy, but when you're in VS Code, very simple to run code. There is the one plugin. Let's take a look at that real quick. Which is, some of you were definitely in the session earlier. There's OpenEdge ABL by Riverside Software. There's a couple others. You can feel free to configure those. This repo is configured to run with the Sports 2000 database on this plugin. There's definitely overlap with the other ones. But if you install this repo, it actually pops up right away. If you clone this repo, open it in VS Code, it's going to pop up and say, do you want to install the recommended extensions? That's a configuration on this repo. And it will, once you install this, everything that I'm showing here will work exactly as I'm showing it right now. And so with that, I was looking at some code. So this is really simple. All this is doing is just running. I just want to show something running. Hit F2, it runs. I got a message statement saying I'm not connected to any databases. I connect to a database. I get a message statement saying I have one. So you should, if you have progress installed, see progress OpenEdge, and you get this repo clone, should theoretically just be able to run this, and it will work. Next thing I want to look at, though, is, and this is really the thing I care most about, is unit testing. Show of hands, how many of you would say your company is good at unit testing? How many of you are running unit tests? All right, a couple. How many of you wish you were running unit tests? Okay, that's a better number. We've had the same exact struggle that I'm sure many of you have had. We're getting better. Of our 6 million lines of code, I think we hit about 14% of them. That number goes up at a snail's pace. If we were at 20% by this time next year, I think that would be high. But part of getting unit testing as a culture, part of improving unit testing as a culture, is making unit testing easy. So one of the things that we've done with our development environments, we did it with PDSOE a little bit, but more so with VS Code. It's certainly a much bigger focus as we start to transition to that, is just making it so they're just insanely easy to run. So I have a unit test here, create invoice test. Actually, let's run this other one, cache maintenance test. Just a unit test, it's maintenance tests. The class is cache.maintenance test in my test directory. I stole the Java hierarchy of folders for this project just because I think it's nice and clean. Much cleaner than what we use at work because that's 30-year-old directories. But maintenance test just tests the same file without the leading test and the test on the end. And if you've written any ABL unit tests in classes, you're familiar with what this looks like. We'll talk a little bit more about the design of the methods and the annotations. But what I wanted to show is tasks. Tasks are, as I mentioned before, something I find hugely valuable. If you do Control-Shift-P, again, command palette for anybody that is unaware, this is how you get to anything within VS Code. Anything you want to do, Control-Shift-P will get you there. There's certainly other ways you can get to some things, but that is your number one go-to. And if you type run task, there is this run task option. And if you are using a different repo, it's going to come up with a couple things. It's going to say, do you want to run a gulp task and ESLint task? There's a couple other things that it tries to interpret, but are turned off in this repo because we have actual tasks. And these three things are scripts that I wrote just for this repo, which we'll take a look at. But the important part I wanted to show is that I have two of these for unit tests. One of them is run ABL unit for active file. One's run for all files. I'm just going to run the one for the active file. And we're going to see it's going to run. And I'm using ant and PCT to do that. But you can certainly call these directly from the command line if you're uninterested in running it via ant. And I get a little error here because I probably broke something earlier and it's a live demo, so why should anything always work? Could not compile cache maintenance tab, which I don't know why. But anyways, it runs it. Let's try and run all of them. So I have that other one. We'll run all of them. And this actually does a compile first, so it's compiling, and then it ran one. So I only had one running. It says it didn't find any failures. Who knows about that other one? I'll debug it a little later. But you can at least see that they run. From that, I get various outputs. And this is all unrelated to that task because that task is pretty simple. But we can see I'll get R code because I do a compile of everything. It's probably unrealistic. You can expect to compile all of your code. I know we wouldn't be able to, just it would take forever, and we want these to run fast. But small project, I can do more fun things. I get profiler output. If you're using SonarQube, you definitely want that when you run your tests, so you get your coverage information. And then you can output whatever else. If you have docs or database updates or anything you want to do before you run a test, you can do that as well. But let's take a look at what that looks like. So there's two ways you configure tasks. First is in this .VSCode directory, which is where if you have a settings file for your repo, a tasks.json, we're going to look at code snippets in a moment. All of your VS Code configuration goes in here. So I have this tasks.json file. And I have a welcome script. We didn't take a look at that yet, but there's a couple things in here. And I really like the collapsing functionality of the editor. So I've run ABL unit for active file, run ABL unit for all files. And you can go look at the documentation for tasks. I'm not going to bore you with all of the details. But just at a high level, basically you give a task a name, you give it a type, shell or process. Shell meaning I'm running a shell script. Process meaning, and I have a process one in here that we'll see an example of. It goes and you run an exe or just basically any process that you can start from the command line. I tend to veer towards shell scripts because I'm a nerd and I love writing shell scripts for some reason to do different things. But essentially what you're getting at is anything you can do in a shell script, which is basically anything you can do with your computer, you can automate as a task. And you can chain these together too. So there's a depends option. You can say before this, do this other task. So maybe if I wanted to do compile separate, I could have a compile task, and then this task calls that one first. And you can, I don't know if you noticed, but it's got like blue beakers to the test task, green databases. You can give it little icons. It's all preset list. But the big difference here is the arguments. So this one, it passes in a file name. And for my other one, for all of them, it just doesn't pass that file name in is the difference. You can also set a kind on it. And this is the kind of the last piece I want to show here. There's not that many kinds. I think there's build and test are the only two options. Otherwise, leave it blank. But what you can see is, and I want to take this is default off before I do this. But there is so where I go here, these are the tasks I've defined. If I do Control-Shift-P, if I just type task, there's run test task. That's just the default test task as defined in that task thing. If I hit that, it's just automatically going to work. I'm going to get that nice little test icon here automatically. So for build and test, you can basically assign default tasks for those things. But there's plenty of other things you can do. Show of hands of Data Digger users in this room. Okay, you got a couple. I love Data Digger. I know that there's plenty of other options out there. If you're using the ABL plugin, you have access to the data dictionary. Not connected, but I don't care because I don't like the data dictionary. It's too small, and my screen's about 4 feet big nowadays. Just the filtering and looking at all the fields and all of the tables is no good. And you'll see I typed Control-Shift-P and then I closed it out. I said VS Code is configurable. I did Control-Alt-P, goes straight to my tasks, instead of having to find them another way. So you can define a keystroke to go right to that if you want. But what I was getting at is I have a launch Data Digger. I can just do that, and it's going to launch Data Digger right here. I don't have to go find an icon or anything else. And in that task, and I know that's small, you don't have to worry about what's in there. But in that task, all I'm doing is defining what PF I'm opening. So you can define multiple tasks. You could create a list and say, open this database, that database, that database, all sorts of different ways to configure that. And I think that runs as a process. So I was launching that as a process, just calling ProWin as an example of something else you can launch. Other tasks that we have at Rocket, we run a monolith. I know monolith can be a bad word. I don't think it's necessarily a bad word, but a lot of times you want to know who owns a file. And we have a whole, I'm not going to get into the details of what that is, but we have a whole breakdown of the code owners. We have a task that says, tell me the code owner of this file, and it opens up our internal mapping tool for that and just brings you right to it. We have tasks for run unit tests. We have tasks for various GitHub integrations, tasks for running different parts of our build pipelines. And really, anything you can think of, anything that you're doing on a regular basis that involves any sort of running scripts, any sort of analyzing code, running SonarQube, other linting tools, whatever it is, strongly suggest all those things, just make them tasks. Becomes much more easy to run. I want to show one more task before I move on, but we'll get into dev containers right after this. So I'm actually just going to reload this window. So it's just like it just opened. I have a startup task. This is one that we use to create a set of schema databases. When we run our unit tests, we run them against Docker because that's where that data set is. But we also have all of our engineers just run a schema database locally that can get torn down and recreated whenever. It doesn't have anything in it. We just connect to it read-only without any of the database safety stuff. And one of the things that happens is we do that when you start up VSCode, because if the schema change, that way you have the schema that is in the repo for the commit that you have checked out. After that, I also put a nice welcome message in, just because we have one that just kind of has links to, hey, you don't know about VSCode, click here. I did it for this project. You can see the sessions that I'm running. You can find that GitHub thing again. So if you don't find if you go to this repo, you can find me from the repo, obviously. But that's something else you can do. If you have a lot of engineers you're training and you're trying to get switched over to VS Code, you can set startup tasks that you don't have to display a message. You could just build databases. And that's in here as well. I think that was the first one I had, welcome startup. And we'll just take a quick look at that. And that does just a couple things, pulls Ant dependencies. Like I said, we're using Ant, so it just pulls the most recent version of PCT, the progress compile tool. It creates a database, says a welcome message. The one we use at work is certainly a little bit longer. For example, we don't reset those databases unless a schema change, so we run the hashes and pull Docker containers, set up some SSH stuff, but generally speaking, it's a really great way to keep environments consistent. If you have problems with, hey, everybody changed this thing, well, this is a way to get past that, because if you change it in the repo, now everybody's going to get access to it as they update the commit that they are currently on. All right, so code snippets really quick. I mentioned that there is the power of code snippets. And then not this one. This is all of the, there's annotations for the unit tests. I put them all in here. Actually, let me just show that really quick as well. As an example, I really like these just because, as an example of snippets, not necessarily because of the annotation aspect, but if you type at test, you can see not only do I get a kind of a brief description of what it's going to populate, but we can also put longer descriptions in there. So this isn't coming from class docs. It just comes from those snippets. So they're maybe not as helpful as a class documentation may be, but if you are like my company, you have quite a bit of code that is not written in classes, so there's no way you're ever going to be able to leverage class docs. So we've used code snippets quite a bit to add that documentation level that we can't get from just compiling and generating class docs. And what I mean by class docs is something like this. So I do, let me just do an assert. Do I need it within a method? I think I do. Does anybody else notice it's always harder to type when you have, and there's Copilot right there. It's always harder to type when you are sharing your screen. But if you do assert, class docs are this. It tells you all of your different things. These don't have any documentation associated with them, so it just gives you the output. But OpenEdge, the OpenEdge plugin automatically generates for those for you. If you are writing good comments on your methods, how many people here are writing good comments on their methods? Okay, good. Not the only one. I don't think anybody is. But to the point of code snippets, let's wrap that up real quick. Another thing we're doing here, and this is where this is the part I want to talk about is how code snippets aren't just, okay, I want to define variable, and I need to define 15 of these for each of the different variable types. Code snippets have the ability to add lists in there. They have an advanced ability to add optional parameters. I think I might have an optional. I don't have an optional parameter in here. I'll get one in at some point and push it up. But essentially, you can define code snippets that they're not quite IntelliSense, but they're bordering that gap. So for example, if I do define variable, and I have defined private variable, and I hit enter, it automatically puts me on the var name, and I can put some var, and then it'll fill in, a list of things. But that list of things can be maybe an optional parameter. So for the lookup procedure, the lookup function, the third input is your delimiter. But you don't have to put that, it'll use a comma by default. You could create a snippet that'll say, okay, 1, 2, 3, but that third one you can just delete and it goes away. Or maybe there's 5 of them, and when you hit the third one, you can choose not to, and you can just hit the backspace key, and then it won't ask you about the other 2. You can do large files. We have a lot of templates for our classes, especially for our APIs. We have 3 or 4 different varieties of APIs for post, put, patch, delete. And when we have developers create new ones, we have templates for all of those, where they can just select the template, and then instead of having to put the name of it in 10 different spots, they type it once and they're done. It makes that component of our development very quickly. I would bet everybody in this room has an area where they have some repetitiveness that code snippets can help with. They can certainly be much larger than just one line of code. We actually even took our ones from PDSOE. Somebody in here is probably using them from PDSOE as well. And then they actually became much shorter in VSCode because of being able to use that repeatable functionality a little better. Okay, dev containers real quick, and we'll hit Copilot last. Dev containers. If you go to the VSCode docs, there's a section at the bottom. I think the overview here, I think this is just the top of their documentation. They have a section for dev containers. This repo has a working dev container. All I did was steal the JSON documentation from, and I did this earlier today. I stole the JSON documentation from there. I'm going to leave that in the repo just for comparison's sake. That's the one that says docs. Quick compare, you can just see there's a few different things in here. Not a whole lot. I'm not going to go through the details of every little piece of it. The essential part is that I have this container, I know it's k-herring OEDB, which is, for those familiar with Docker, it's just the progress 12.2 the database container. With all I did was install Java. I did not push my license key in. That mounts at runtime, and then run a couple scripts to add an ABL unit and some other things. Nothing fancy. There's a lot more here than actually needs to be there from me testing some things. Clean that up and push it up at some point here. But essentially, all it's really doing is saying, "Hey, mount my license key, run it as a user, install Git on the fly." And what I get is, so right now we're running locally. This is running on my window. This runs progress from Windows. But what we could do is we could do dev container, and you can attach to a running container. So if you want to run that container attached to it, I think I want rebuild and reopen in container. I'll let it do it with the cache. We'll see what happens. Oh, Docker's not running. Give it 1 second. Give it a moment. So while we wait for that. So yeah, there's not a whole lot here. But you can set it to run things, and there's a couple ways to do it. So I'm installing Git here after the container runs. We don't do that at work. We don't have that. We actually install it into the container so that it's preloaded. Reason being is that it's just a lot easier to preload things. Secondly, I don't know, Progress, if anybody from Progress is in the room, why can't we have containers like that run Ubuntu or something instead of CentOS 7? That would be nice. But you have to install like a bunch of extra stuff to get newer versions of Git. But for the sake of just showing what this is, we're installing it on the fly. Wrong keystroke. Dev container reopen, rebuilding container. It's going to do some stuff. It's going to run. It's going to reopen my window. We see at the top it says I'm in a dev container, which means that VSCode is running this front end locally on my machine. It hooks into that container, installs some stuff to SSH. I'm not a networking expert by any stretch of the imagination. But essentially, I think it's tunneling, it might be the terminology, into the container. And all of this code is mounted in that. I think I have it mounted, but you can copy it into the container as well. There's different options for it. And then if we go to like a terminal, for example, it's still installing Git, so give it a moment. But it's just running that post create command. So you can do all sorts of stuff there. If you had different things you wanted to do, you can get it to do that. But then we can see, I'm clearly not on Windows now. If I look at my current working directory, I'm in Workspaces Bug Challenge. This is running as a command line within that terminal. Anything I try to run, if I do ant compile, this is running, you see DLC right there, /progress/DLC. This container does not need to be running on my machine. I could be running this container on a network server anywhere else, and I would be doing exactly the same thing that you're seeing here right now, because this is the only thing it's dependent on to see this on my machine is that VS Code is displaying the output via that remote connection. So they're incredibly easy to set up. If it's something that you're interested in for keeping consistent environments, I highly suggest it. If you don't want to go as far as dev containers, there's still a lot of value in that containerization. So I talked about briefly our cardinal sin of starting unit testing, and this was, I've had this at a couple different teams and places that I've worked on, and it seems to be a common theme, is that they all start unit testing right before I get there, and they all decide to start with a set of data. This is the data we unit test against, which sounds really great for bootstrapping and ramping up and getting unit tests running, and then a year and a half down the road, you can't update your maintenance data because all of your unit tests break. But if you end up in that situation, Docker containers are a really good way to stop or to help with that. We don't have the unit test problem anymore because all of our engineers know that the only proper way to know a unit test is passing is to run it against our unit testing databases, which are in Docker. We update the schema, but not the data, and you could pull it anytime you want and run those unit tests. And we don't have to use a dev container for that because your database connections are set up so that if you're running that container at all, you're connecting to the database within that container. So you don't have to go quite as far as dev containers. You can simply just have your databases running. So none of our engineers anymore run local databases. They're just start a Docker container. And that's one of those commands that happens at startup. It says Docker compose up, and then their databases just work. And it's been really nice because we don't have to debug why people's databases break anymore. So that's, if you want to go halfway there, that's been a step that was hugely valuable for us. If you want to take it even a step further, dev containers are incredibly easy to get started with. Certainly, you can make them as complex as you want. I think everybody in this room has probably done that at some point. I know I have and will again. But at least the time to get started with them should be incredibly easy. And you can use this repo, certainly as an example, to try it out. Lastly, okay, 6 minutes left. I'll try and use 4 of them. I'll just want to show Copilot real quick. And if anybody has other things they want to see with it, try it out. If you haven't had a chance to try Copilot, come find me after. Or tomorrow. I'm happy to try some different things out and see what works. Minor, maybe not minor, but just before I do this, just a stipulation. I don't have a lot of progress code in this repo. This is my personal machine. This is not my work machine. I don't have 6 million lines of progress code for it to think on. I get much, much better results in the repo that I work with. And I think that's for 2 reasons. One, that it's not pulling as much from the internet because of the configurations we have for our internal GitHub. And 2, it just has much more local code to pull from. So it is much more consistent at getting code correct the first time. But in playing with this, I think that we will get something. So just as an example, I'm just going to type a comment here, and I'm going to say, this method updates an invoice with a new amount. And then we're going to see, does it do it by itself? Sometimes it does. But if not, I can, let's see. Oh, I'm in the dev container. I don't have Copilot installed. Let's try this again. So you could install Copilot in the dev container. I don't have it installed in the dev container, so it's not, that extension isn't there. I didn't touch on that. Extensions can automatically be installed in the dev container, so everybody has the exact same ones when it starts up. That is a selling point. But that is not the case, and it doesn't help me use Copilot here. Okay, let's see. It's thinking, and let's see what it got. For anybody, let me do that again. For anybody that didn't see, that's Copilot. That came up. It said, okay, it read my comment, and it said, okay, what did it do? And let's see what it came up with. Does it even compile? That's pretty good, because sometimes you'll get it, and like, especially Progress, for some reason, it thinks it's Python once in a while. A lot of times it won't compile right away. It'll have bad field names. It's not aware of your database. It's not aware of syntax necessarily. It's kind of imagining things. I think there's another word for it. But it came up with it. It's find first invoice, exclusive lock, no errors, pretty good. If it found it, update the amount. Return true or false. I like that. So Copilot just came up with that right then and there. Anybody have another suggestion for a method here? What else could we do to an invoice? Oh, how about this? It's already thinking. It's telling me what I think. So return the invoice amount. Maybe. I'd rather have it look. I think it needs to look through the lines. Oh, no, that's probably the orders, though. Let's see if it does that. Add up. And sometimes it starts guessing. Yeah, sometimes it starts guessing when you start typing a comment. I find this is incredibly helpful at 4:30 afternoon on Fridays, because I'll be sitting there looking and being like, okay, and then it'll just pop up. And if it gets, so like, look, order.update, that's not a thing. Like that doesn't make sense in Progress land. But it at least got an outline. If I don't like the outline, what else you can do is here, if you hit Control-Enter, you can tell it to do more solutions, but it'll synthesize a bunch of solutions, and you can look through the list and pick. So certainly it's going to come up with things like this, where that doesn't make sense for this code. But as far as solving repetitive tasks, coming up with the basic outline for what you're trying to do, I have found it incredibly helpful. Not because it's helping me not need to know what I'm doing. You still need to know exactly what you're doing. You need to know where the pitfalls are. You need to know about security problems, things like that. But it makes me faster, especially on repetitive activities and getting things that I'm about to type out, that I've typed out 1,000 times before, done quickly. And then from there, I can focus on the bigger issue. Is this readable? Is this maintainable? Is it going to pass all the things that we're worried about? And so, yeah, if you haven't used Copilot, a couple quick examples. Like I said, I'm happy to show more, but I know we're at time. Got time for one question, 2 questions maybe? So they haven't kicked me off stage. Oh, yeah, let's try it out. So debugger, here is a breakpoint. Debugger, when you set it up, there's run and debug. It's not going to be set up automatically for you. Let's see if it works. There's a bunch of different ways to set it up, so I don't need that. But I ran it, it says use port to connect to. If you use the regular Progress debugger, it connects to Progress through the same methodology. But I hit enter. It's always going to stop here because it needs a breakpoint, though that's not totally true, but just assume that I'm saying that correctly, and then it stops on my breakpoint. Set more breakpoints. Stop it and start it again. And it works pretty good. We connect to it, so we use a lot of shared environments because our databases like to run in production are very, very big. We can connect to our shared environments across the network, and it works. Oh, am I getting a window that I'm not seeing? Yeah. Let's try it again. I don't like that hides that window, but there is a way to get around it, popping that message up, which I may share at some point, but you can see, and then you can just step through. So yeah, debugger works. It's getting better with time. It doesn't have the watches and some of the stops. I think we'll see that added as time moves forward. But certainly works. And I'll take one more, and then we'll wrap up. You guys feel free to stick around. I can stick around and ask other questions too, though. All right, just last slide here real quick. Just because my dog would be pissed if she knew she didn't get the spotlight at the end. Just VS Code's an IDE for the future. We're modernizing, as much as I hate that word. Plugins make engineering easy. Simultaneous cross-language development, I didn't get to show you that, but I have a Java project you can open. It looks exactly the same. Debugger looks exactly the same even. Docker can provide additional consistency. I hope I've showed some examples of that. There's certainly many more than I can show you in an hour. But you can certainly explore and find different ways to get consistency out of that. And that's all. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. Hope you enjoyed this. If you want to see more about Docker and VS Code, specifically related to build pipelines, and how we're using those same Docker containers that we run unit testing against in our build pipelines in Circle CI to do our pipeline validations. I'll be talking about that at some point tomorrow. I don't know the time off the top of my head.
11:45.
Wait, I'm sorry?
11:45.
11:45.
In the La Moranza.
But yeah, feel free to come see that, and we can talk some more about it.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you.